Thank you, Anne. I heard Anne's presentation at the last TEDxBelfast, and it was fabulous. And so it's really nice to be here in this amazing building for tonight's event. And wasn't that last presentation just extraordinary? I think I'm great if I take the bicycle from home to the office and I just see what Leon's been doing. That's amazing. I want to begin and to end with a question. And the question I want to begin with is just to wonder how many of you know that next month Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand are going to begin their match for the World Chess Championship. Now, I only say this because in chess circles, people are describing this match as the most significant World Championship match since 1972, the match between Boris Spassky and Bobby Fischer. But looking around the room, I suspect there's only a few of us who actually were around in 1972 at the time of that match. I certainly remember it very well. I was young, very, very young. But I'd learned just to play chess a couple of years before that match. But I was absolutely engrossed by the match and all the things that were happening around it. In fact, I was so engrossed that for the next decade, I did little more than play chess and practice chess and read about chess, which I guess probably explains why, unlike most of my friends, it took me a bit longer to discover girls. But one of the things at that time, at one stage I was running a chess club in my school. I was the secretary of the chess club where I lived. And in my local parish, I set up a chess club, mainly for young people to come along and learn how to play chess, and so that I could teach them how to play chess. And there's two of those youngsters that I still remember very well who were in that chess club in the parish. And I remember them not because they were particularly good chess players, although one of them actually was quite good. But I remember them because of the way they died. Liam Canning was 19 in 1981 whenever he was shot by a UVF gunman one evening as he was coming out of Ardoyne. Dennis Price was 22 in 1985 when he was one of 9 RUC officers who were killed in Newry police station when it was hit by an IRA mortar bomb. I haven't played serious chess for an awful long time. I work in education, as Anne was saying. And I know every one of you have some connection with education, whether it's as a teacher or a parent or a student. And I wonder how many of you would share my ambition that we should be able to do something through our education system, something creative, something important to try and heal the wounds of our society. Well, over the next 12 or 13 minutes, I hope to tell you what I think we can do through education. Now, obviously, when we think about the role of education in a place like Northern Ireland, we think of our history. One of the issues which looms very, very large is the fact that our education system is divided on the basis of religion, and that has to be the starting point. So let's begin with a look at history. The origins of our education system can be found in the establishment of the national system of schools, it was begun in 1836. Lord Stanley was one of the key officials in Dublin Castle who was behind the idea of establishing a national system of schools. And he suggested, he recommended, that whenever proposals were coming forward for the establishment of new schools within the national system, preference should be given to proposals that came from joint groups of clergy or parishioners from different denominations, to try and encourage a system that would involve everyone, children from all different denominations in the same schools. Now, in fact, that didn't happen. Within 10 years, it became very clear that all the churches wanted to run their own schools, which would serve their own community. And so the pattern of denominational separation was set very early and continued right through the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. The next important stage came after partition. Lord Londonderry, the first Minister of Education in Northern Ireland, brought forward an Education Act in 1923, and he wanted to make a break with the national system, because at that point all of the schools that were on the island, north and south, were owned by and run by the churches. He wanted to make a break with the national system and move closer to the sort of system that was then in operation in England when local authorities looked after schools. And his 1923 Act provided a mechanism for the churches to transfer their schools over to local authority control or state control. Now, he didn't expect at the time, given the context of the time, he didn't expect the Catholic Church to hand its schools over, and his expectations were duly fulfilled. But he did expect the Protestant churches to hand over their schools. But in fact, they didn't hand over their schools either. For the next 10 years, they ran a big campaign working through the Prime Minister's office and working with the Orange Order to try and get various educational amendments to the legislation, essentially to try and establish their right to be represented on the boards of the new state schools. And after 10 years, they were successful in achieving all the amendments that they wanted to achieve. So what happened by that point was we had the system of Catholic schools, and now we had a system of state schools that was in all but name Protestant schools. And so the denominational division, separation, was reinforced. And that was the situation right up until the 1960s, whenever the Troubles began. And once the Troubles began, and once we tipped into that nightmare, which we were to have for 30 years, people started to think about the type of society we wanted to have in Northern Ireland. At various points during those years of the Troubles, people returned to that question and asked what type of society we wanted. When the violence ended and the peace process was put into place, and we've had the last 15 years or so of peace, at various points along the way, people have asked the same question: what type of society do we want to have in Northern Ireland? And every one of those occasions we've been faced with essentially the same choice. Do we want a society which institutionalizes difference and it sees politics as a way of managing difference? Or do we want to try and create a shared society, an interconnected society, a more cohesive society? And that remains the question that faces us in politics today. And it's a question which has a particular resonance in education because of the divisions that exist within the education system. When you look back over the last 30 years, there have been lots of work, lots of initiatives, lots of interventions put into place by educators at various different times, often overlapping. And I think it's possible to identify 4 main areas of intervention that have happened over those years. The first is interventions based on the curriculum, trying to get new curricular programs and new common textbooks. And we've seen this in the teaching of history, the teaching of religious education, the teaching of things like education for mutual understanding, or most recently in a particularly innovative program that was developed by some people in the University of Ulster, the teaching of citizenship. So that was one very, very important area of intervention. Another important area of intervention was the development of contact programs to try and bring young people from different schools together on joint projects. At one point, this was the major activity that was funded by the Department of Education. And at one point, most schools were involved in some way in these contact programs. The third main area of intervention was to develop new integrated schools. This began meaningfully in 1981, whenever the first new integrated school, Lagan College, was opened, to prove that it could be done and to prove that it could be a success. And they proved that it could be done, and they proved that it could be a success. 65 or so integrated schools now operate. It's almost unique in the world because there is hardly anywhere else where an entirely new sector of schools has come together because of the commitment and energy of parents and in the face of so much opposition. And the fourth area that we can identify is in the late 1980s and early 1990s, because of a concern over fair employment, because of a concern over equal opportunity, equalising funding of Catholic and state schools. A very, very important initiative in terms of a statement to the Catholic community about their place within Northern Ireland whenever Catholic schools were given the same level of funding as the state schools or the Protestant schools. But when we look back at the impact of all of these, what has it done or what has it achieved in terms of transforming our school system? This was a question that we asked ourselves, a number of us asked ourselves, in the context of the ceasefires, after the ceasefires and after the political agreement, and in the years going forward. What had been the impact of all this work in education? And to be honest, the conclusion we came to was that while there was some extraordinary work done by extraordinary people, inspirational work done by inspirational teachers, the system itself hadn't changed in any significant way. If you think of the curriculum, for example, no matter how good the curriculum, no matter how good the textbooks, what a young person receives as the curriculum in a classroom depends on what a teacher does when they stand up in front of them and talk. And we know from the evidence that for a whole variety of reasons, too many teachers are too unwilling or feel unable to actually address some of the greatest possibilities in the textbooks and the curriculums that were available. I said in the contact programs, at one point most schools were involved in contact work, and that, on the face of it, looked quite good. but the proportion of young people who are involved in these contact projects was very, very limited. The projects themselves were very limited, very ephemeral. They often didn't address the difficult issues that needed to be addressed in order to tackle some of the problems and give young people the attributes and the language and the skills and the ideas to try and tackle those problems. So an awful lot of the contact programs were of little consequence in any sort of longer term. I said the integrated education movement was an inspirational movement, and it was and it is, and there should be more of them. But it remains a small part of the system. At the moment, about 7% of our young people go to integrated schools. That proportion should rise. I'm sure that it will rise. But as for the foreseeable future, it's going to be a small part of the system. And we were interested in trying to think of something that could have system-wide impacts much more quickly than that. The equalisation of funding did have a significant impact in terms of patterns of performance, which have changed considerably because of the change in funding. But it hasn't actually changed the issues around division. So whenever we started to look at some of the evidence and the consequences of all this work, we were concerned that the impact hadn't been enough, and was it possible to conceive of some way in which we could work through education to have a much greater systemic impact and do it in a much quicker time. And we needed to try and think creatively about what we were doing and what we might do. And one of the things that we did was to think about the way we thought about schools. Schools are legal entities. They are measured and they're tested as if they're autonomous units. All policy treats them as if they're autonomous units. Everyone thinks of a school as having its own history and its own traditions and its own ethos. So we always think of schools as if they're autonomous units, and there's almost an expectation that each school should have the power to look after its own destiny. But we started to think about schools somewhat differently. We started to think about schools not as autonomous units, but as part of an interdependent network that was connected to one another. The things that happened in one school had consequences for other schools, whether people like that or not. Even the process of competition between schools helps to spread out the patterns of experience and performance. So we began to think of schools as I say, a part of an interdependent network. And if you think of schools as part of an interdependent network, then we have a new area of possibility to explore in terms of what we can do, and that's to focus on the relationships between the schools rather than on the schools themselves. And we started to ask ourselves, we put these institutional barriers between our young people through these schools. We've spent an awful lot of time arguing, and it had become a sterile argument. Should we have separate schools or should we have common schools? What if we could do something with those institutional barriers? What if we could make those barriers porous? What if we could put bridging processes between the schools so that young people could move between the schools to take classes? Teachers could move between the schools to share experiences and learn from each other. They would have the confidence and the sense of identity because their school existed. But if they're moving between the schools through these porous boundaries, then you potentially could start to think of changing the relationship between young people in the local area and between teachers in the local area and maybe between parents in the local area. And if you could do all that, maybe you could start to change the relationship between communities in the local area. So that's what we set out to try to do about 6-7 years ago. In the first wave of the work, we established 12 partnerships or networks involving about 65 schools. We ran that for 3 years. Then we got some more funding and we established another 12 networks or partnerships, this time involving about 72 schools. And along the way, another 2 partnerships joined in. And we worked with these schools to try and explore this, how this could be done in practical terms, how they could work collaboratively, whether it was possible to achieve a situation where children were moving between the schools to take classes. We collected masses of evidence. The graph just shows you the number of young people who were routinely moving between schools over the course of the project to take classes in other schools. In the first year, we had about 2,000 young people who were doing this. By 2011-12, we had 6,500 young people moving between schools to take classes on a routine basis. Because in an important body of work that added to our thinking, some of our colleagues in Queen's were doing work on the idea of contact, and what they came up with was that contact would work. It could have a powerful impact if it was sustained and regular and happened all the time. We were trying to create new habits, make these collaborative patterns, this cooperation, this sharing, a permanent feature of the way in which the schools operated. Along the way, we learned a number of important things. One of the things we learned was that there isn't a simple template that you can just drop into an area. You need to talk to the people in an area, talk to the schools, try to come up with a tailored solution to try and tackle issues around sharing and collaboration, because the circumstances, the conditions, the challenges in different areas are different. So it has to be a locally tailored solution. It's important that it has interlocking benefits. The reason we were doing it was because we wanted to establish processes in local areas that would encourage reconciliation by bringing young people together in that ubiquitous, permanent, common way. But schools would only address this for reasons that were perfectly understandable if it also contributed to a school improvement agenda. It helped them to raise their standards. They would only do it if, or another reason for doing it would be if they saw the possibility of making more effective use of resources. And if you look at what's happening in other countries, you see collaboration between schools happening for exactly those reasons. Schools are working together collaboratively in local areas because it's a way of raising standards. Schools that collaborate on, for example, the new technology suite, working together, they can have one technology suite that's better than either school can have separately and overall will cost less. We've got some schools now putting exactly those sorts of proposals forward. Another lesson that was very important was we needed to create space and opportunity for teachers to innovate. And education systems generally are really, really bad at that. Education systems, particularly the big bureaucracies that administer education, like any bureaucracy, works on the basis of predictable actions. And because of that, they're inherently conservative. And because of that, anytime they spend money, they're so afraid of accountability that everything has to work. So you look at all these big change initiatives in education, and they're evaluated, and everything works, and nothing ever changes. If you're going to tackle new problems, you need to develop new solutions. And if you want to develop new solutions, you can't keep looking over your shoulder at past practice and using old solutions to old problems. You have to liberate teachers to explore options, come up with new ideas. Every one of them has a little bit of the solution. And you need to help them connect those dots and to try out new things. That also means that you have to accept that sometimes the things you try won't work. And that's another thing that education systems are very bad at. They're very, very intolerant of failure. But you will never, ever develop innovative solutions to new problems unless you tolerate some failure. You learn from failure, and that's really important. The other thing we learned from this, and that this was particularly crucial, was that relationships are massively important. Whether it's relationships between young people, maybe even more important, relationships between teachers. You have to build in opportunities for parents to get to know each other across the different schools. And that has an impact in the wider community. But that is so important that you have to create space for this to happen. You can't just do this in a top-down, mechanistic way. You have to give space for people to get to know each other, to build relationships, because that's how you develop trust. And it's only with the relationships of trust that you can get over the anxieties and the fears and the concerns that people will have about doing this type of work. So those are some of the things that we have learned over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, working with some of these amazing schools and amazing teachers in these schools, and just being blown away by the commitment and the energy and the creativity that they bring to the whole process. When we began this work, in the first year, we did a survey of the of the pupils. And 40% of the young people in that first year told us that they had never met someone from the other community. And this was a decade, a full 10 years after the referendum on the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. 10 years of peace, and 40% of young people said they'd never met anyone from the other community. I visit some of the schools now that we're working with, and when I walk the corridors, I see kids with 2 or 3 different uniforms walking around together, socialising together. I go into classrooms, and I see kids with 2 or 3 or 4 different uniforms sitting beside each other, learning together, and everything is working fine. I go to prize nights and see kids from 3 different schools wearing the uniforms, receiving prizes and awards on the same night, and their teachers are there, and their parents are there, and everybody is proud not just of the achievement of the individual pupils, but proud also that as a community they're pulling together to do these things. And what's most amazing about this is that school uniforms in particular used to be the symbol of our division. And here's the situation where they're a visible manifestation of our ability to transcend those divisions. We talk to the politicians all say they support it. We talk to the churches, they say they're behind it, they're prepared to support it. We talk to the unions, they say they're behind it. After the statement by the Minister of Education just a few years ago, it looks like there's official endorsement for it. And it looks like also there's going to be resources available to try and roll this out over the system, to give us the real possibility of having an impact on not 10% or 20% or 30% of young people, but in a relatively short period of time, have an impact on 80% or 90% or maybe even 100%. We're on the cusp of that possibility. There's an opportunity now to do that. The planets are aligned, and we have a moment to try and do something, I think, absolutely wonderful. I want to do this. I think it's important. And I want to do it because I want to honour the memory of Liam and Dennis. And I also want to do it because I want to do it for the grandchildren I hope I will someday have. And I want to leave you with one final question. And that question is, who would you want to do it for?